Yes, you absolutely can apply real-world military strategies into games of Warhammer 40,000. And today we're going to look at 3 strategies that are influenced heavily from real history. Of course, Warhammer's a fantasy universe, and real warfare is an unimaginably serious matter, but there is an unsurprising amount of overlap between historical strategy and tabletop wargaming. But it should be said, they don't translate completely from a real-world setting to a game like Warhammer 40,000.
Because you've got the whole huge heroes and giant monsters, which don't really have that much of a equivalent. So you've not going to get a superhuman figure in real life which can take on squads of men by themselves in melee combat and win.
That's my buddy Pete Sizer, a doctoral candidate at Bath Spa University. He's got a background in military history and is looking at counterinsurgency in wargames for his PhD. And by wargames, I mean everything ranging from tabletop wargames like Warhammer to looking at military wargames used by the US government and military before the war in Vietnam. That being said, supermen have existed, but not for about 1,000 years.
If we're going back to, say, the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the 1066 campaign, when the Vikings invaded and the Saxons were defending, there was one giant warrior who did hold a bridge for a long time, and he ended up getting stabbed from below after somebody went into the river with a spear.
My groin!
Moving swiftly on from taking a hit to the gentleman vegetables, Pete told me that there's a bit of a misnomer applied to the term strategy on the tabletop. In military terms, what we're doing when we're coordinating troops and playing games on the tabletop is actually just tactics, not strategies.
40k is purely tactical, whereas the operational level would be linking together a series of battles, and the strategic level is running a war. And I think the misconception comes from computer gaming, starting with Command & Conquer back in the 90s, being billed as a real-time strategy game when it's a real-time tactical game.
So an actual strategy game would probably be something a bit more like Total War, where your strategy is planning the entire war from beginning to end. But what are some tactics that we can take from real life and place into our games?
Obviously, the military thing is fire and maneuver. But you've got to sort of fire at the enemy to suppress them so they can't shoot at you while you're maneuvering round. With 40k, squads can move and fire, but if you wanted to be sort of more cagey about it, you could have a pair of squads, one of which you could advance and not fire, and you can sort of leapfrog up the board from cover to cover that way. Would be a cagey way of doing it and would replicate small unit tactics in the real world.
Whilst firing and maneuvering is basically just moving troops about on the board, you can then level this up on the battlefield by using our first beginner-friendly tactic, and that's staging.
So that is about getting your troops into the right position to be ready to do what you need them to do later in the game, or for that crushing strike that you're going to do on your next turn.
That's my friend and regular competitive player Goss, and he explained staging to me on a recent trip to London's Bad Moon Cafe, a fantastic gaming spot. You should definitely check it out if you're in London. Goss told me that there's broadly 2 different types of staging.
So you can be in a defensive kind of posture where you're thinking about, right, I'm keeping these units stage out of line of sight so my opponent can't get easy shots at them. They're behind ruins, they're blocking, they're out the way, or they're positioned far back to stop your opponent from doing some shenanigans.
This is largely about thinking about how you can use the battlefield to your advantage and start thinking about how you can plan to keep troops in cover whilst they get ready to launch an attack and claim an objective.
When we start to think about offensive staging, this is about getting your units up the table, generally close combat units, and you want them to be in a position where they can't be seen by using the terrain to your advantage, and then they're ready to go charging hell for leather out of those ruins from behind that wall and then strike in close combat or something that's going to be maybe on a midfield objective, maybe on the flanks. Try and really get your opponent, because your close combat units are fragile generally, they don't really want to be shot at, and you want to make sure that they're all alive for that all-important crunch when they finally get into combat.
So that's staging. What else is around in modern warfare and is noted as still being a thing in 40k? Well, tanks are a big thing, and they don't look like they've gone anywhere in 40k.
So after World War One, Britain did a lot of experimentation with mechanized warfare, where we sort of used half-tracked trucks to carry squads of men around to keep up with the tanks. For basically budgetary reasons, even though we had an early start, we didn't have the money to keep this going throughout the 20s and 30s. So by the time World War II started, it was only really the Germans who had half-tracks, and in those you'd have a squad of men. But unlike most transports, which would just drop off troops at the edge of the battle and then pull back to keep themselves safe, the German half-track had a machine gun and was designed to support the squad going in with direct fire. So it's like a 40k Rhino in a way.
Yes, I admit it's a bit of a cheeky beginner tactic on my side, but using transports is definitely a military tactic that is used by most armies in 40k. And the lore of the vehicles in Warhammer share some of the grimness of early mechanized warfare, as Pete was telling me.
World War I and the advent of the tank in 1916, of the Battle of the Somme, and it really came into its own in the later stages. And somebody had the good idea that, seeing as a tank is so good at crossing difficult ground, barbed wire and trenches, that they should extend the size of a tank and put a squad in there. So once a tank has crossed the trenches, a squad can get out and take the ground, hold the ground, and go on to further stuff. The slight problem with that was the inside of a World War tank is a horrible place to be. There's engine, really hot temperature in the middle of the fighting compartment, not screened anywhere. The exhausts going into the box, plus all of the cordite fumes from the guns firing. And most tank crews ended up with mild cases of carbon monoxide poisoning at the end of the battle, but they were kind of used to it. So by the time they'd sort of got a squad to cram inside this nasty, noisy, gas-filled hot metal box, and then being bounced around and getting motion sickness, by the time they'd got to the objective, they weren't fit to fight.
It's not just about putting a squad in a vehicle and having the squad pop out somewhere that is the tactic. How you position your troops after the transport gets destroyed can be incredibly advantageous to your state of the game, as Goz shows here with a Necron Ghost Arc.
Tag onto the objective, they're kind of hard to kill, your opponent puts some dedicated anti-tank in there, and then lo and behold, once it blows up, your infantry then spill out and then are now on the objective as well. So again, that's a great way of being able to hold your primary against your opponent's vicious shooting attacks.
Whilst this is a great tactic in-game, this is where what Pete calls the artificiality of the game really shows itself.
You could, in real life, send troops into battle with a truck, but the truck's not bulletproof, it'd get badly shot up, and you'd need the truck for after the battle to keep the operational mobility. Because if you've lost all your trucks in an assault, even if you win the battle, you can't chase the enemy away because you've lost your transport.
When Pete talked about this, it just reminded me of the absolute ludicrousness of games of 40k. The amount of losses that you take in a game would just be absolutely devastating if applied in a real war. Anyway, certain big tanks can block line of sight, which is why I love Land Raiders, as there's barely any way in hell you can see through the side of this chonky boy. So positioning your vehicles to your advantage will be incredibly helpful. However, if you can see through any part of the vehicle, such as an Eldar Falcon, it won't block line of sight. And vehicles also don't grant cover, so you won't be gaining an advantage if a model is just sticking out the side. You also don't need to use just transports to try and secure objectives. Our final beginner-friendly tactic to try is double dipping.
What we're talking about here is making sure that you've got 2 units that are tagged onto your objective markers. This will basically try to mitigate the potential of you losing that objective marker, especially when it comes to things on the flanks of your army or the ones that you're moving onto into the middle of the table and you're trying to hold to get your primary points.
This is a really simple thing to just try and build into your games. I personally like to have a unit that sits on my home objective that is spread across the back to stop the deep striking ability of my opponents. This is known as screening and is a bit more of an advanced tactic, which I'll talk about in another video. But on double dipping, it is probably a bit more of a game-centric idea than a military one, as obviously most objectives in Warhammer are quite abstracted.
You've got a series of geometrically arranged circles which give points out to win the game, which bear little relation to the sort of terrain you're fighting. But again, there's sort of tactics you can have from real world, which would apply in a 40k game. So if you've taken heavy losses taking an objective, you've got to make sure that that unit can either be replaced by another stronger unit, or has a support from a different unit behind it, which can fire in its defence, because the enemy is bound to want to counterattack and retake the objective to again score the points.
This, however, when applied to a real-world setting, can actually have some pretty devastating consequences.
So in World War II, in the Normandy battles, the German doctrine at the time was to always counterattack after losing somewhere of importance. And the British exploited that, because as soon as they took an objective, they rushed as many heavy weapons into it as they could, knowing the Germans would be, within a matter of minutes really, trying to counterattack. So often the Germans lost more men in the counterattack than they did in defence of that thing. So places like Hill 112 in Normandy, it was a battle for the biggest hill in the area, which wasn't particularly big, but if you're the only hill in the area, you've got observation across the entire front, so it was vitally important that you could either deny the enemy use of it or get use of it for yourself. And the fighting there was horrendous, with masses of losses, to the point it was more attritional losses than in World War I. That's how much of a meat grinder it was on just that little battlefield. But again, once the Brits had taken it, they could rush up the machine guns, the anti-tank gun. So when the German counterattack came, there was defensive weapons in place to defeat the counterattack and cause a lot more casualties.
So there's your 3 basic tactics that you can use in your games: staging, tactical transports, and double dipping. Now obviously we're able to have fun and play games and it's all rather abstracted, but I do think it's worth occasionally reflecting about how real-world warfare has influenced the games that you and me play. You look at some of the old World War I tank designs and you can immediately see the influence that they've had on games of Warhammer. And Pete told me about this one incident from the 80s Iran-Iraq war that I didn't know about and has clearly had an impact on Warhammer.
Some of the actions in the Iran-Iraq war of 1980 to 1988 was about as bad as warfare could got in the 20th century, with untrained militia mobs charging machine guns and biological and chemical warfare. It was, horrendous, and fairly little known in the West today.
Yeah, that's put me off playing cultist blocks for a little while. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like, and please consider subscribing to the channel. A big shout out to Amberly Clark, who has become my first patron and is a Tabletop Parlour member, the top tier of my patrons. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can become a member over on Patreon for as little as £3 per month, where you can access community competitions and gain early access to videos. Or if you'd like to do just a one-off, you can get me a pot of paint over on Ko-fi. If you'd like to watch some more stuff, there should be a video popping up on your screen right about now. Thank you very much.